Welcome to the fourth day of the International Webinar Series organized by the Department of Political Science and Public Administration, St. John's College, Anchal, in association with Internal Quality Assurance Cell functioning in the college. Dear participants, thank you for joining with us. Just a reminder, kindly put off your audio and video throughout the session. Towards then, we have a Q&A session that then you can on your mic and ask questions. There will be a recorded version of this session in our YouTube channel. Thank you for joining with us. This international webinar series is designed for anyone who would like to explore more about the emerging trends, research trends in social and political sciences. The department primarily intends to provide students an opportunity to listen and interact with some of the notable scholars across the globe working on important research areas. Today's speaker is Shalini Rudra, who is a researcher at the University of Warwick, UK. Mrs. Rudra had formerly worked with Tata Trust and Observer Research Foundation and published extensively on different aspects of public health. Her research interest pertains to the use of public policy frameworks to improve population health. Today, she will speak about the political economy of health, an area highly relevant in the context of the unfolding COVID-19 pandemic. Mrs. Shalini Rudra, a warm welcome to the session. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I'm really glad you've invited me for discussing the very emergent topic on political economy of health. And I'm really glad that uh, there are students who and obviously department that are interested in looking at political economy of health very early on in the UG and the PG degrees. And it's really interesting that the way the country's role is expected and envisioned in the COVID crisis. It's really interesting that we are now talking a lot about health and its interaction with politics and economic relationships in the country as well as around the world. So, for my talk today, I will restrict myself on discussing in a small way what political economy of health entails, and then I will move on to the kind of work that I am doing on access to medicine campaign and how I um, use political economy framework to understand things that are not visible to a common person and how research can help us analyze it in a better way. And then for if time permits, I will actually for giving you a flavor of how political economic relationships are unfolding under COVID crisis, I will discuss the alternative that COVID-19 crisis can provide and hopes that I have on research that is going on for COVID-19 cure and how it can actually help us achieve a good balance between um, power hierarchies that we have in health around the world. The political economy of health generally deals with structures, forces, and processes that shape health outcomes and health systems around the world within the wider economic and political context. By structure, here I mean actors, stakeholders, and institutions, the designing and organization of health systems, governments, governance, and resources. And with forces, I mean there are certain visible and invisible influences like role of the state and the government, capitalism, which can be understood in terms of the role capital and technology plays, international laws like trade regimes, various paradigms and ideologies. For instance, universal health coverage is one ideology that is driving a lot of governments across world to deliver on deliver in terms of health to their citizens. Therefore, if we think broadly, the political economy framework of health directs our attention to a larger context and helps us recognize that the health outcomes are influenced and also to be understood in the light of social, political, and economic factors. The political economy framework also allows us to explain certain policy ideas or reforms by referencing them into material conditions and various interests that sustain them. So these are mitigated by actors and processes and forces that actually govern them. For instance, if we are using political economy framing of health sector reforms, we can draw on ideologies that govern it, beliefs and values that health systems and governments have for them and for their citizens, and also by enforcing certain laws or bringing about certain reforms, who are going to benefit from it. We know that in the larger context, in the way the scheme of things, we know that resources are not just based, or not just allocated based on needs, but also based on power and forces that make various actors put various processes to work. And these can be understood in terms of power, position, and relationship within hierarchies, within different hierarchies. So my presentation today will be limited to understanding these structures, forces, and processes. And I am going to use the example of access to medicine campaign. And I will highlight the role that various systems, actors, and organizations played in changing the neoliberal policies which governed the production and supply of medicines around the world. It is if we start with access to medicine campaign, we can understand how problems with access to essential medicine provide an extraordinary analytical context in which we can explore the realities of how multinational corporations and capital governs the outcomes of health in and around the world. This access to medicine campaign is also an example of how big pharma companies sued Nelson Mandela government for providing access to cheap generic medicines for HIV/AIDS patients in their country through importing them from countries that produce generic drugs which are cheaper versions of patented medicines. I am hoping that people are aware of what WTO is and what its role is in making international trade laws and making intellectual property rights through trade-related practices of intellectual property rights agreement, a harmonized law across the world. So with that assumption, I am assuming that everyone knows what patented medicine and generic medicines are, but just for clarifying these terms, I'm going to speak a bit about what they are. So when a big pharmaceutical company invests in research and development for innovating a new medicine, they get benefit out of it by getting a a monopoly rights over producing and marketing and profiteering from a new innovation that has come about. So it's called patenting of a medicine, patenting of a molecule, and there are various kinds of patents like use-based patent and product patents and process patent and things like that. So this is largely a protection of research and innovation investment that the pharmaceutical company has undertaken. But it is also for a specific period, so it's generally for 20 years. But there are certain conditions that, if gets violated, or probably if they are applicable, that, like for example, if there's a country that has a huge burden of a specific illness which can be cured by a patented medicine, but because the patented medicines are generally cost at a very high price, at a very high rate. So the government of those countries can import cheaper versions of those drugs, provided that there are certain companies somewhere in the world making a cheaper copy of patented medicine by um, uh, a compulsory licensing agreement that they have with their government as well as the company that has patented that particular medicine. So when Nelson Mandela government decided that they want to provide their citizens with generic medicines for HIV AIDS, which are antiretroviral therapy. It's called antiretroviral therapy. Then it violated a lot of laws which were pertaining to intellectual property rights, and that is why the pharmaceutical companies sued Nelson Mandela government for violating TRIPS agreement, and a lot of that unfolded into a sort of a larger movement that gained um, some impetus through HIV/AIDS, but it is all we can also see that these uh, these campaigns gets carried on even today, and we see when we see there's certain litigation happening by some firms against governments, and then the Supreme Court of various countries comes back with certain decisions and things like that. So yes, so that is the small background. So if we start with South Africa, we know that South African government had its own challenges after gaining freedom, and also in a post-apartheid era. So they embarked upon changing a lot of policies, and they changed a lot of constitutional. They brought about a lot of changes in competition law and public health law. Its struggle over access to medicine was highlighted when a civil society organization working for accessing medical treatment called Treatment Access Campaign brought a complaint against pharmaceutical industry to Competition Commission, and when Commission reviewed the prices of certain drugs, they found that there is no evidence to support the high prices that the company was charging. While even when you take into account the cost of production, the research and development cost that they incurred, or appropriate rate of profit that the margin that they were allowed to charge, these charges were the price charged by multinational firms for supplying HIV/AIDS medicine were very high and were unjustified. When the case was referred to a tribunal for excessive pricing, pharmaceutical industry made a settlement with the compliant, and this led to an agreement where the companies can actually companies came out and said that we can issue a voluntary license for certain antiretroviral therapies to produce to their generic competitors, and these competitors can actually provide ARV medicines to HIV AIDS patient in South Africa. In response to this condition, the new government, the Nelson Mandela government, published a new drug policy in January 1996, which was basically aiming at promoting use of cheap generic medicines, and also it was an attack on high costs of drugs that was prevalent in South African market at that time. It also gave a certain sort of freedom to state to facilitate and make available the cheaper affordable medicines to the private sector, which was termed as, so it was called a Medicines and Related Substances Control Amendment Act of December 1997, but it's generally known as Act 90 of 1997. But it was generally aimed, the main aim was to bring down the cost of medicine, and also to make certain medicines available to its people at an affordable prices. Now, this act of South African government can be seen as an attempt to improve access to essential medicine by creating a more competitive market through considering parallel importation from countries that are making cheap versions of antiretroviral drugs, and also through compulsory licensing they were issued if issue they were allowed to issue compulsory licensing licenses to the producers within South Africa who can make generic copies of patented antiretroviral therapies and supply it to their government. But very soon, this ideology of South African government attracted an attention of international pharmaceutical industry and US government in particular, which instigated an action where Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association of South Africa, at that time that included all the local pharmaceutical companies, subsidiaries of transnational corporation and multinational corporation themselves, they filed a suit against a Nelson Mandela government challenging the constitutionality of Act 90, which led to a long battle which was fought by patient groups on one end, civil society organizations and civil society participants on the other end, and South African government themselves to get access to medicine at the price which was affordable to them. While this was happening, United States actually went ahead and issued a lot of trade sanctions against South African government and its trade, and there were huge economic implications of it. This threat of wider economic repercussions also highlighted the conflict that domestic initiatives have juxtaposed against the global environment in which the autonomy of governments are being questioned. So it's also important to recognize that at an international level there was a tension that was building up between approach taken by governments, local governments in adhering to the interest of their own citizens vis-a-vis policies that they have to follow internationally in order to maintain a steady trade. This litigation of South African government but by United States is also a trade issue, but at the same time, when there are people's life involved in it, I think it was also an issue of human rights, and that's how it got. It wasn't confined to being a trade issue itself, but it was raised. It also surfaced at World Health Assembly by in WHO, where South Africa was actively trying to reshape the way pharmaceutical protection against pharmaceutical companies were being considered as a trade issue alone. But it is also not a trade issue only because it has larger implications of people's life at being at cost. So yes, so if we consider this kind of frame, and if we look at it from a political economy framework, we can see that there are different forces that comes into play. There are different organizations that have to play a role to, for example, in this case, the civil society organization participants activists had to actually intervene to make various governments understand what does it mean to be fully compliant to TRIPS? Because the way the World Trade Organization has written these laws, it was so difficult for them, for developing countries to understand what being a signatory to TRIPS or being fully compliant to TRIPS would entail. So there are these civil society actors that played a crucial role in bringing about Doha Declaration, which is actually a sort of an agreement between various countries, which came about considering that if there are certain conditions that are being not meted, like for example, a country has a large public health crisis and it cannot afford patented drugs at that huge volume because they're priced very heavily, then there are certain ways to get these medicines affordable medicines supplied to these countries through compulsory licensing and parallel importation and things like that. So the way the Doha Declaration came about was a sort of an agreement which was which was considered by various parties involved in it, but was mobilized by patient lobbies on one hand, which were actually very actively engaging with policymakers and various governments in South Africa, Brazil, Thailand, and India at that time to access these medicines because patented medicine wasn't affordable at all. And also civil society organization coming together and uh, in some ways allowing various governments to actually understand the full obligation they would be under um, if they would comply with TRIPS in full, I mean, in the way it was designed initially. So yes, this is an example in which Access to Medicine campaign actually gives an example in which we can understand how political economy framework is used to understand health outcomes and how these various health outcomes come about and what are the factors that influence them and what are the key outcomes that we can target if we want to look at economic and political relationships of various governments, various organizations. In fact, it can be political economy framework can also be applied at a state level or at a country level or between various actors and between various for example, bodies to understand how health outcomes are actually not just an outcome in itself, but it's governed a lot by how policies are designed, what are the forces that are influencing these policies and policymakers, and how these various actors are understanding or probably what these actors can understand from various issues or various ideologies that governments have. So yes, this is one example that I have been working on, but it does not. The access to medicine became successful in access to medicine campaign initially for HIV/AIDS was successful in granting voluntary licensing to various providers, and India suddenly became a largest producer of generic medicine because it has had a protected a process patent protected pharmaceutical sector, and it was ready with the knowledge of producing generic medicines, copies of patented medicines by the time TRIPS came about and India opened up, and India then became the largest generic supplier to South Africa and also to Global Fund, which Global Fund was an agreement that United Nations and WHO came up with. So Global Fund was a platform which was devised to buy cheaper medicines from various countries that are producing them like India and Thailand and provide them to countries where they are needed the most, where the HIV/AIDS patient could not afford medicines to buy patented medicines. So when we look at access to medicine campaign and its within the political economy framework, we can actually see that unfolding even now it is when we see that there is the same kind of debates that are resurfacing in the context of COVID-19 crisis. We've seen that there are certain drugs, for example, remdesivir, which has shown some efficacy in um, dealing with complications of COVID-19, and it has had some efficacy in treating people who have certain complications. But we have to also understand that this remdesivir is a patented medicine, and it was produced by Gilead, a pharmaceutical company. And now we have a lot of debates around going around as to why should the medicine that is treating treating patient COVID-19, which will be required across the world, should be patented. A, and B, what is the future of any vaccine or medicine that we will find or probably discover in near future? What is it? What kind of protection will these innovators be getting? Because it's also not only a question of providing protection for the research and development investment and innovation investment that these companies are incurring right now, but it's also the scale at which we would need it. Suppose we find a cure and we have a vaccine developed, but we might need it for all 7 billion people across the world. Does it really mean that profiteering for something on which is going to be sold at a larger scale is a better idea? A, or secondly, is it really needed? Because we, even if it is patent protected, we will have to we will have to disseminate it to all countries. So there's no question of monopolizing on something which has to be given to a, it's like a blanket sort of dispersal. We have to give it to all the countries, to all the people, and getting it for some people at a higher cost and for some other at a lower cost does not make sense. And then there are also issues around how do um, how what is the role that transnational organization like World Health Organization plays in mitigating solutions for a pandemic like COVID-19? Because we have seen that WHO has been cornered by certain interests in terms of financing and the way funding for COVID has taken place. We've seen that there are sanctions being levied by United States government on WHO for not having come up with an immediate response to contain the spread of the epidemic, and WHO's role sort of looked like it was going to get compromised, but of course it wasn't compromised. They still managed to garner funds, and many countries have actually come forward and have helped WHO in continuing the effort that they had made towards mitigating COVID-19 crisis. But yes, so these are the larger themes around which we can consider future research on political economy of health coming about. I mean, these are the larger issues that I think are raised and are very apt right now, because the way the whole debates around how our health innovation, or how health research and development is being financed, are questioned. We cannot let research and development on something as important as pharmaceuticals or vaccines be developed or be controlled by vested interests of certain governments or certain donors. We have to have a sort of a delinked sort of public health investment or research and development investment in developing vaccines and medicines, because they are not simply products that we can profiteer from. And these are also strange times, because we have to now question the way the whole R&D investment around pharmaceuticals, something as important as drugs is and vaccines, is designed. So I think it is time that WHO should take an initiative and dealing the kind of investment that we need for innovating new drugs and new therapies with private investments, because we can't have private initiative driving certain research and not taking up something else on board. So yes, that is my discussion on political economy of health. I don't know if I am really helpful, but in highlighting emerging issues, but this is what is. I think, very important and very it's key to um, think about when we are thinking about political economy of health framework. Can I just go ahead and start answering questions that have been given to me?
Yes, ma'am, sure.
Yes. So, I the first question is, although it's very interesting, the question is Indian women are at 2.5, 2.7 times more at risk of dying from COVID-19 compared to white women. It is indicated a provisional analysis by the United Nations Development Program. How will you respond to this analysis? You know, I actually lack expertise on commenting on this, but yes, I know that Indian women, there's been some published research and there was some discussion last month around it, and we have found that Indian women are at higher probability of dying from COVID-19. But as far as my understanding goes, I think it is also because women's health in general is not considered a priority in Indian settings, I mean, at Indian households. So it could be that the way Indian um, health system caters to only certain aspects in women's health, only related to fertility and not other issues. I think that is why women are more likely of getting impacted by COVID-19 as well. The second question was Indian health sector is in transition phase and it is more and more moving into privatization mode. The COVID crisis, however, demand a strong public sector as only a government hospital system can deal with a pandemic situation. As a person who has worked on implementing health policies in both public and private sector, what is your opinion regarding this issue? I clearly see that when it comes to a public health crisis, it is very important that government um, of those countries take things in their own hand because simply because it's public health, it's not private health. But given that, I also trust that government of India gives a lot of um, rebates, and there is appropriation of public funding, a lot of appropriation of a lot of private sector comes with appropriation of public funding. I think private sector can also be involved in delivering when a government is in crisis, like the one that we are currently facing. The way the way private sector can be roped in all depends on the way governments envisage their role in it. So there can be a very strong regulatory framework through which we can actually involve private sector into delivering. After all, India is a country in very highly populated and it also has places where government has reached, but private sector hasn't reached at all. So if we, in my understanding, if we divide the kind of places where the presence of government is more and the presence of, for example, in cities, presence of private sector is very good, but presence of public sector in rural countryside is so important that only public sector can take initiatives in rural settings. So if we divide the kind of role that private sector can play where they are profusely available and the kind of role where government sector can play, public sector can play where they are at a advantage position because they have been serving in rural sector for a very long time. I think a kind of a balance act is what government of India or basically any government should play in terms of crisis. And I think I'm of a very strong opinion that roping in private sector in delivering is very important, is key right now. The third question is, could you please elaborate about the influence of corporate interests in drafting and implementation of health policies? So the kind of discussion that we had around access to medicine is exactly this. The kind of private sector interests are driving a lot of healthcare policies. Insurance sector is one, for example. But what is key for each government is different. What is it that, suppose, for example, there are countries that have very good public health sector, but they also have pressing needs where their inequality is very stark. They have pressing needs for example, Obamacare and Medicaid and Medicare are certain examples when there are segregated priorities for government, and where they can actually say that corporates cannot influence. These are the policies that we want to undertake, and we cannot let corporate influence them. Influence these are is important, but of course it completely depends on government again, as I can understand it. But understanding what your priorities are, where is it that protection is most needed, where is it that private sector can take over and corporates can actually influence, is something that government has to decide on its own. But corporate interests are huge in influencing healthcare policies, and I think trade policies and international trade laws have a huge role to play. But if countries of global south can actually come together and have a sort of a stand against these international laws and uh, globalization and capitalism, I think we can still achieve a lot. Fourth question is, do you think privatization of healthcare sector will ultimately contribute to national development? I think it will, because my reasons for it is because there are certain priorities that government has, and it cannot take on everything on board. When you have a sort of a segregated um, priorities, health for certain sections is important for government, but when private sector can take care of certain health needs of certain sections in a society, I think it should be allowed to participate. But complete privatization is, of course, not possible, and it is inefficient in its way, because private interests are motivated by profit, and we can't let health or health system be governed by private interests at all. The last question was, what is your opinion about the role of WHO in solving global health crisis in future? This, I think I spoke about it in part, but I would say one more thing. WHO for a very long time was, for its financing, was dependent on um, fees that signatory countries uh, pay. But I think in 1990s they did away with it, or they brought it down to a very minimal amount, and their dependency on donor-based funding for financing increased, and that is where a lot of um, uh, driving of its agenda for each World Health Assembly started to be governed by donors, because they were the largest funders. So I think, looking at current crisis of COVID, I think WHO should really revisit its financing modalities and see what it can do away with, and what is it that it should undertake in order to streamline its funding in a big way. Of course, countries are ready to pay, and there are countries that can actually pay more than other countries, but then again it is going to be driven by those. So of course, changing the way the WHO obtain its fund is one way that WHO can actually change its course and see how um, its future um, interventions will not get jeopardized because some certain donors have decided to not fund it. So yes, so this is one way WHO can actually decide how it wants to go about in changing the way it's being financed. And that's it. That was the last question.
Now the floor is open for discussion. Dear participants, you can ask questions or you can enter your questions in chat box.
I am actually accessing the meeting software from my phone, so I don't know how to see chat. If there are any questions, can the moderator please read them out?
Sure, ma'am, I'll read it out for you.
Thank you.
Dear participants, the floor is open for discussion now. You can ask your questions to Mrs. Shalini Rudra.
If there aren't any questions, it's okay.
So I think we can conclude this session. Uh, Thank you, ma'am, for your great presentation.
Yes, can I add something? If there is something that people want to follow up on or read up, I can actually send. If you can circulate my email ID, I think I will be able to send them some readings, or if anything that interests anyone in working on health or working on political economy of health in general, I can actually send some stuff to read, some literature to read, and also if they want to discuss their um, research questions or term papers, I will be very happy to discuss them online through
Sure,
emails.
sure, we'll do that. That would be great. Okay. I, on the behalf of Department of Political Science and Public Administration, St. John's College, Anchal, extend a very heartfelt thanks to you. Thank you for accepting our invitation and making such a wonderful presentation. It was really helpful because uh, this time we are going through an unprecedented health crisis. Thank you for enlightening us by sharing your findings and opinions. Uh, we hope that our department could collaborate with you in the future. Thank you, ma'am, for being with us
Thank
here.
you. Thank you for inviting me. Thanks a lot.
And thank you for everyone who attended this session. We hope that we can meet you again. Our final day of the international webinar series will be on October 17th at 10 a.m. on the same platform. We hope we will meet again, and thank you for your support and joining today with us. Thank you.